class. Welcome back. This is chapter 36 in your textbook. We're going to be talking today about population ecology. So what do we mean by population ecology and why do we want to study this? So we talked in the last chapter a little bit about parental care and the parental care in specific to the father and how this affects both the parents and the offspring. So has parental care evolved by natural selection? Think about the fact that there are some fish, there's different types of parental investment, meaning the time and energy expended on the offspring to ensure that the offspring have a good chance of survival. So, for example, there are some species, fish for example, that carry the embryos internally and give birth once the eggs have hatched inside the fish. And this is a selected method of reproductive success, the improvement of reproductive success by making sure that the offspring are already alive before they hatch. Some fish don't do it this way. They actually invest in producing more eggs and expending their energy in a vast quantity of eggs, producing millions at a time, and that sort of being their method of selecting their method of survival of their offspring. So in this chapter, what we're going to talk about, we're going to learn about the structure and dynamics of different populations and how traits like parental care can affect the population's growth rate and successes in different habitats. So ecologists are constantly studying this to gain greater insight into natural populations and to become better equipped with how to assess the human impact on human population growth and the balance of human needs with the conservation of our resources to be available for the continued growth in our population. So the big ideas in this chapter are population structure and dynamics. So population ecology is concerned with the characteristics that describe populations, changes in population size, and the factors that regulate the size of populations over time. And then we'll finish up the talk talking about the principles of population ecology that can be used to describe the growth of the human population and the limits that we have on that kind of growth. Okay, so let's just give you some overall definitions of what we mean by population dynamics and population structure. What are we even talking about when we talk about a population? So you remember last semester, I know it's going back a ways, but we talked about how biology is organized, and one of these categories of organization is a population. So that's a group of individuals of the same species that live in the same general vicinity. So they're interacting with one another. So that we're talking about this study of population ecology and population dynamics is the study of how these populations interact with one another and how populations change and why they change. So individuals in a population, they rely on the same resources because they're in proximity with one another, and they're also, for the same reason, influenced by the same environmental factors, and they breed and interact with one another. So this study of population ecology, again, is looking at how changes in population sizes occur and what the factors are that are going to regulate population changes over time. So these populations can increase. There are different ways populations can increase and decrease. They can increase through increased birth and also through immigration of individuals into a population, into the region. And it can decrease through increased death or emigration out of individuals out of the population. So just a clearer definition of what population density is, this is the number of individuals in a species per unit area or volume. So it's the number of individuals per, for example, square acre, or per 100 square acres. So it's how many per area we're looking at. And these populations can vary greatly. So there can be a population of the same species in one geographic location, which is much, much larger and much more dense, so many more animals per square unit, than in a different geographic range. And we'll talk about the different types of environmental factors that can lead to changes in population densities in different locations. So this study of population density also talks about not just how many individuals are in a location, but how they're dispersed through that location. So we talk about these dispersion patterns. And this is how the individuals space within their defined population area. So there are some that are in a clumped dispersion pattern, and this is usually where the resources are not equally distributed throughout the environment, throughout their area. So they're patched around the resources they need to survive. They can also be uniformly dispersed, meaning that there's essentially the same number of individuals no matter where you look. And this is because the environment is pretty typically uniform throughout. And in a random dispersion pattern, this is where individuals are spaced in an unpredictable way. And this typically happens because the individuals are dispersed by some influencing factor. So an example of this are dandelion seeds. So dandelions are dispersed in a random pattern because as the seeds blow in the wind, they just land in a random location. So it's not based on, they're not clumped in one spot based on resource availability, and they're not dispersed uniformly because the wind directions change. They're randomly dispersed because that's how they end up being. Sorry about the lag in my slides here, guys. So we're going to talk about life tables and survivorship curves. Scientists love to illustrate things with pictures and tables and graphics. So we'll just take a look at a couple. Okay, so this is a life table. Tables meaning it's information that's laid out in columns and rows that show numbers. That's what we refer to as a data table. And curves and graphs are displayed more in with lines and bars and things like that. So this is a data table, and this tracks survivorship. So the chances of an individual in a given population surviving to various ages. So basically, this is the U.S. population for 2011. This would look quite different for an area in a developing country. So this is just telling us these probabilities. So this is the likelihood that an individual will live from between 0 to 10 years old. So if you have 100,000, roughly 770 of those 100,000 will not make it to age 10. So the chances of survival are more than 99% in the U.S. So the chances of making it to the age of 10 is more than 99% in the U.S. So you can go down this table and see we're gonna see this N number quite a lot through this talk today. So just remember N just meaning the number that we're working with. Just again, looking at this table, we can go down to how likely you will be to make it to the ages of 60 to 70. You've got about an 88% chance here in the U.S. 90 plus is the U.S. population rate is likely not to make it over the age of 90. So that's the kind of information. This is how population data can be displayed and communicated to the public. Okay, I mentioned that there are curves and graphs. So there are other kinds of graphics that we can use to communicate scientific information. And this is a survivorship curve. And survivorship curves, they plot the survivorship as a proportion of individuals from an initial population that are alive at each age. So we're looking here, this on one side here we have the percentage of survivors and the percentage of maximum lifespan on the other side. So by using a percentage scale instead of actual ages here on the x-axis, we can compare different species with different varying lifespans. So as you can imagine, a clam has a very different lifespan than a squirrel, and they both have a very different lifespan from a human. But we can put these all on the same picture, the same graph, and show this comparison using these percentages. So what we can see is that the curve for the human population shows that most people survive to older age intervals like we saw on the table. So we refer to this type of curve as a type 1 curve. Also, type 1 survivorship. Species that exhibit this type 1 survivorship are humans and other large mammals. They're usually produce few offspring but give them really good care. So it increases their likelihood of survivability to older ages. On the other hand, this species that have these type 3 survivorships, like the clam, it shows that they're very low, so their percentage of survivors drops off pretty heavily right at the very beginning. And then the ones that do make it can live a long time, but their survivorship numbers really declines pretty rapidly. So these types of species usually produce a large number of offspring, but provide little or no care for them. So some fish, for example, like we already talked about, can produce millions of eggs at a time, but most of the offspring die because they're preyed upon very early when they're really tiny. And then there are some species like the squirrel that are somewhere in the middle. This type 2 survivorship, and it's kind of constant over the lifespan. So that means that there are no more or less individuals at one stage of life in the cycle than the other. So a lot of rodents and lizards and other vertebrates are in this category here. So one of the ways that we can make predictions based on some of our observational data that we have had over time is the use of what we call models. We use models to predict patterns of population growth. And what that means, what models are, essentially, it's creating a mathematical expression to be able to calculate predictions based on data that we already have. What we're talking about here is population size will fluctuate as new individuals are born or immigrate into an area, others die, emigrate out. So how do we estimate how this is going to affect future generations? So we use this model which assigns these terms that we can use and plug numbers in and calculate them. So we're going to have this equation here named of G equals R times N. So G meaning the growth rate, how fast a population grows, is equal to the initial size of the population times the rate of increase. So that is how the contribution each individual has for the time interval. So it's how many, the per capita, which means per person rate of increase. So how many offspring per person is that R number. Okay, so when a population is expanding without limits, that R remains constant. So that what we get is a curve. So this, going back to this equation here, going back to this equation here, what we get is we can plot over time. We can plot we can plot the results of this equation as populations increase, and it gives us what we refer to as a curve. And you can see why they call it a curve. Sometimes it's a straight line, sometimes it's a jagged line. It's not always a nice even curve like this. This nice even curve is what we call exponential growth. So what that means is that when the numbers are small, when the populations are small, so remember G, sorry about my pen, equals Rn, right? So if this R is staying the same, when the numbers are small, since this n is small, the growth rate's going to be small. However, once you reach larger numbers, once this n is a larger number, the rate of growth is going to be greater, because in this equation, a larger n is going to give us a larger growth rate. I hope that makes sense. So that's not ideal, because we're going to talk about the fact that if all species were growing exponentially in that way, we wouldn't have the resources to take care of them and to sustain that kind of life. So there are other types of modeling that we can do, referring to this logistic growth model, which represents that populations typically don't just continue to grow at the same rate forever. There's usually some reason why they level off at some point in time. So this logistic growth model brings in this other factor called K, which allows us to consider what we refer to as the carrying capacity of the environment. So what that K means, it's a representation of how of what the limit is on how many of a species the environment can take care of. That has how many resources are available for how many of a species. So this kind of curve, it's that we have this, that the first part of this, the equation stays the same. Sorry about the pen. But the G equals Rn is still in there. But then we have this other part of the equation that accounts for, and we're not going to go into how this equation was developed, but this part of the equation accounts for that carrying capacity. So the capacity of the environment to sustain a number of a species. So the maximum number that an environment can sustain or carry. So that's where the carrying, I don't know why they change it from a K, from a C to a K, I think because C is other things, so many other things in math, but that K represents the carrying capacity. So this is what those types of curves look like when we take carrying capacity into account. So typically there are low populations, sorry, this is actual data from fur seals. And what they found was there were low populations before 1925. And the reason for this is that before 1925, there was uncontrolled hunting of this species. So the populations were really kept in check and actually threatened for a while there. You can see back in the early 1900s, this species, there was uncontrolled hunting. So they were growing pretty rapidly. And they grew this way. The population increased till about 1935, and you can see here in 1935 it levels off. And the reason it leveled off was because once there were enough of these individuals in the environment, they ran out of resources. They ran out of room for breeding grounds. The food became limited, so fewer offspring were being born. So this is where we can see that carrying capacity was taken into account. Okay, so going back to these two equations, this is the first one, just exponential growth, and we can see that in this rabbit population in the example here, the number of individuals just keeps going up and up and up and up and up to infinity. So that's just because n is constantly getting bigger, so the g is always getting bigger if we keep that r constant. But if we use this other equation, taking the carrying capacity into account, so it's the carrying capacity minus the number of individuals over the carrying capacity, we get these curves that look more like an S, what we call an S curve. So this blue curve is an exponential curve, and then the red curve is referred to as an S curve. So again, this carrying capacity, we represent it with a K because it varies depending on the species, what kinds of resources that species is reliant upon, how available those resources are in the environment, and many other factors. So this carrying capacity is it's this concept that expresses the essential fact that that natural resources are finite, and that at some point populations become limited based on that carrying capacity. Okay, so this is just an example of doing some of those calculations and how the effect of carrying capacity on the growth rate, as the growth rate reaches the carrying capacity, growth becomes slower. So again, looking at this example here, if you start with a population of 10, you have a growth rate of the R times N is 1, your carrying capacity is 0.99, so it's essentially sorry folks, I had a distraction at the door, so let me back up just a moment. So this here is it's demonstrating how this expression here, this K minus N over K, is producing this S-shaped curve where growth is really quick in the beginning and then levels off. So at the outset, the population, the N size is very small compared to the K. So here, see, we have K of 1,000. So the population size is very small compared to this K, the carrying capacity. So the carrying capacity is 1,000. The actual population is only 10. So we're going to see that growth rate, if the growth rate is 10%, that's going to it's not going to be affected too much by that K value because there's plenty available. But as the N reaches this carrying capacity, this fraction is going to make this probability of more growth closer and closer to 0. So again, this is just again showing you how we have quick, rapid growth rates at the beginning, and sort of increasing throughout over time until it reaches a capacity that becomes unsustainable and finally is unable to sustain any further growth. Okay, so there are multiple factors that limit this this carrying capacity and the capability of population growth. So I've already mentioned there can be things like limited food supply increased mortality, which could come from more predators. There could be factors affecting birth rates. We talked about DDT at the beginning of the semester, so that was decreasing the birth rate in predatory birds. Or many of these things combined together. Some of these things can be not. So these things here that we talked about here, the food supply and birth and death rate, those are density dependent factors. So those are things that as a population's density increases, those kinds of factors may come into play as far as how population is increasing or decreasing. But there can also be density independent factors, so outside influences like a catastrophic weather event or a volcano eruption, things that are not dependent upon how many individuals there are, but can still affect can affect a population size. So these things are usually happening in tandem. Usually the populations are influenced by a mixture of these density-dependent factors along with fluctuation, along with density-independent factors. But some species, some populations, particularly things like insects and birds, and even some mammals, will undergo really dramatic fluctuations. So they'll have what we call boom and bust cycles. So they'll have a period of time where their populations explode and then periods of time where they decline very rapidly. And what we see is this actually looks like it's kind of a graph that goes up and down. And this can happen for a number of reasons. So we'll walk through an example of a couple of species that do this, one of them being a species of rabbit called snowshoe hares. So this is a species that was observed over many, many years and was known to have this kind of boom and bust cycle, life cycle, that they were super abundant and then they kind of disappeared and then became super abundant again. So there were a couple of different hypotheses trying to explain what was going on with the life cycle of this hare. And they kind of connected it, not kind of connected it, they actually ended up connecting it to another species, a lynx, that was living along with this animal. So the first hypothesis that they came up with, they determined that there was a boom, there were a lot of bunnies, a lot of hares, they would overgraze their winter food supply, which would cause their, eventually once the population became large enough, cause the mortality rate to increase, and then there would be a big bust. They would all die over winter, and there would be a smaller population, and they'd have to rebound that population as the environment rebounded. So they wanted to test this hypothesis, and they did. So what they scientists did was they influenced the environment by providing more winter food for the hares, and they observed test populations for over 20 years and collected data. And what they concluded, they kept seeing this boom and bust cycle. So they concluded that their hypothesis was not supported, and that food supply alone was not responsible for the boom and bust cycle of this animal. So then they started looking at that lynx species that I mentioned. And their second hypothesis was that maybe there were times of excessive predation upon the hares. So what we see here, we have the hares population graph is in black, and these kind of jagged ups and downs are those boom and bust cycles. And as you can see, as they started looking at the lynx population, they have pretty similar peaks and valleys in their boom and bust cycles as well. And what they did, they actually started tagging the hares, giving them, I think, some kind of marker so they could identify them and track them. And they found that 95% of hares were killed by predation. Then they focused an area, they fenced in an area and tracked those animals, and they found that the bust phase of the animals that had the predators fenced out practically went away. So they were not experiencing that bust cycle. So their second hypothesis of excessive predation driving this boom and bust cycle was supported. Evolution can also shape these patterns that we see. So natural selection can give a species a particular type of life history. And what this means is it's a series of events. It's what happens to a species from birth through reproduction and to death. And there are some species that we refer to as R-selected, and their life history means that they're more selected to reproduction. So they're small-bodied, short-lived animals like insects and rodents, and even plants like dandelions, things that produce lots of offspring really, really rapidly, throw the offspring out into the environment, and then the survival is based on the numbers. So the survivability is low, but there are so many of them that the species can proliferate. And then there are some species that we refer to as K-selected, and these are traits. These are organisms with that are larger bodied, longer lived. They develop slowly. They have fewer offspring, but they care for that offspring throughout much of the life cycle, so that is what leads to the success of the reproduction of that organism, of that species. So things like elephants and people, and an oak tree. So oak trees put a whole lot of energy into their acorns. They store it in there. It takes a long time for an acorn to develop to a seed that can plant a tree, and it's a slow-growing organism that develops over time. So this is K-selected organisms are the kind of life history where the population density is closer to that carrying capacity. So what this means, if we're talking about carrying capacity, how do we regulate how populations are growing? And maybe regulate's not the right word, but how do we manage how resources are able to stay sustainable so that species don't become extinct and we don't damage our natural resources by overusing them? So this is one of the reasons that it's really important to study population density and population dynamics. We need to maintain high enough populations for species to proliferate, but still allow the environment to be replenished so that we can continue to sustain future generations. So according to the scientists that study this and use those really confusing equations that I threw at you at the beginning of this talk, the best growth rate, the most desirable and sustainable population size is when the population size is about half that K value. So that's where we can really be comfortable and sustainable. The environment is replenishing along with the growth of the populations. Okay, so we've talked about a bunch of different animal species. This is extremely important to study in the human population because, as you know, our human population is continuing to grow, and it's important that we study and understand how the growth of the human population is influencing our environment and how sustainable we can continue to be. So we know that the population started growing pretty rapidly during the 20th century, and right now we're more than 7 billion people on the Earth. And what we saw is something called a demographic transition. So this is when our population shifted from high birth and death rates to low birth and death rates. And we'll see that throughout the nation, throughout the planet, different areas where development is more advanced in some areas, these demographic transitions are in different states. In developing nations, death rates have dropped because of advancements in medicine, but birth rates are still extremely high.